Just another overconfident nurse playing doctor. That's what Dr. Mercer had said 2 weeks before everything changed. He didn't know Captain Ashley Cooper had performed emergency thoracotomies with a combat knife in the Hindu Kush. He didn't know her hands had held together soldiers who bled out under mortar fire. He didn't know the quiet night shift nurse in Navy scrubs was a legend in places that don't exist on maps. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it ended careers. Seattle General in Norfolk hums with fluorescent buzz and antiseptic sharpness. The night shift breathes differently than days. Quieter. Slower. The kind of quiet where you can hear the ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythm down empty corridors. Ashley moves through the hallways in Navy scrubs, her movements economical and precise, each step measured like someone counting distance to cover in a firefight. It's 11:44 p.m. She's been a nurse here for 14 months. 14 months of keeping her head down, of accepting dismissal, of watching incompetence without correcting it in public. 14 months of pretending to be someone she isn't. Her locker is in the break room, 3rd row, grey metal-painted institutional beige. She stops there before starting her shift, the same ritual every night. Her hand finds the folded flag triangle immediately, edges crisp, hospital corners perfect, the colors still vibrant. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reynolds. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The flag had arrived 2 months after his death, shipped to her with a letter from his mother who didn't understand what her son's nurse had been doing in Afghanistan. Ashley doesn't unfold it. She never unfolds it. She just touches the corner, lets her thumb rest on the fabric for 3 seconds, then closes the locker door. Pain is data. She files it away like all the other pain. The night shift briefing is finished by 11:52. Standard census. 12 post-op cardiac patients, 3 trauma admissions from a highway accident on Route 64, 2 ICU holds awaiting transfer. Ashley listens without taking notes. She remembers everything. Perfect recall has been a liability for 14 months. She knows the doses residents miscalculate, the protocols they skip, the corners they cut. She's corrected 2 medication errors in the past week. Both times she did it quietly, without accusation, without making anyone look bad. Both times she was met with resentment. 3 months ago, before Ashley was assigned to the night shift, before she was briefed on Colonel Bradley Shaw arriving for his cardiac surgery, everything was different. The briefing had taken place in a secure room at Naval Station Norfolk, off base, 0600 hours. No windows. 2 Pentagon officials, no names. A tablet with Shaw's medical history and a photograph of a man in dress blues with silver stars on each shoulder. The colonel's carrying signals intelligence from Operation Enduring Freedom, one official had said, her voice the kind of calm that comes from giving the same briefing to people who already knew the stakes. OPSEC requires someone embedded in civilian care. Someone trained. Someone who can protect him without drawing attention. They'd pulled Ashley's file. Captain. 127 field surgeries. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. No family outside the military. No ties that would make her hesitate. You're the only option, the second official had said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Ashley had nodded once and said nothing. By the next week, she had a nursing license under her civilian name, a background that checked out, a cover story that held. By the week after that, she had a position at Seattle General on the night shift. By the week after that, Colonel Shaw had arrived for routine cardiac surgery, aneurysm repair, the report said, completely ordinary. The briefing hadn't mentioned that Shaw's intelligence made him a target even stateside. It hadn't mentioned that his aneurysm might not have been entirely natural causes. It hadn't mentioned any of the things that made this more than a standard protection detail. Room 3 West sits at the end of the West Corridor, past the supply closet and the medication dispensary. Ashley checks it every 30 minutes, more frequently than protocol requires, more frequently than anyone else on the unit. The patient inside is stable, heart rate 72, blood pressure holding at 118/76, oxygen saturation at 96% on room air. But she checks anyway. Colonel Bradley Shaw sleeps with his left arm outside the blankets, the 4-line in his wrist taped down with precision, the heart monitor displaying its quiet rhythm like a metronome. He's in his 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man whose presence makes the air pressure change. Ashley doesn't acknowledge him beyond the clinical assessment. She doesn't read his chart with extra attention. She doesn't linger. But every 30 minutes, she's there. Checking. Watching. Waiting for the threat that hasn't materialized yet. At the nurse's station, resident Dr. Patterson is writing orders for a trauma admission. His second year, competent enough for routine cases, dangerous enough for anything complex. He's ordering a 2 milligrams bolus of midazolam for sedation. The patient, according to the chart, is already on a fentanyl drip. The combination would suppress the respiratory drive dangerously. At 11:58 p.m., Ashley sets a chart down beside his computer. No drama. No tone. Fentanyl's already running, she says quietly. 1 milligram midazolam instead. Patterson's face tightens. I wrote the order I intended. Ashley doesn't argue. She doesn't push. She just looks at him without expression, the kind of look that's learned in places where incompetence gets people killed. 1 milligram, she says again, and walks away. By midnight, the order is corrected. Patterson had changed it himself, quietly, without comment. This is the pattern. The correction, the resentment, the private humiliation of being overruled by a nurse. It's only a matter of time before that resentment finds the right audience. Dr. Mercer's office is on the 2nd floor, but he's on the unit tonight. Unexpected rounds at 12:17 a.m. He moves through the cardiac wing with the confident stride of a man who's never been questioned, salt and pepper hair swept back, his watch, something expensive, probably Swiss, catching the fluorescent light as he gestures toward patient rooms. 20 years as chief of surgery. Published research. A reputation for precision that borders on tyranny. He arrives at the nurse's station while Ashley is updating a post-op chart, her handwriting clinical and detailed, every vital sign logged, every observation notated. She doesn't look up when he passes. Mercer notices this. The not looking up. The focus on the work rather than on acknowledging his presence. Most staff stop what they're doing when he walks past. A nurse should straighten up, acknowledge, defer. Ashley continues charting. He slows. Reads her name tag. Ashley Cooper, RN. There's something about her that irritates him immediately, the way she moves, economical and purposeful, like someone who's done this work for more than 14 months. Like someone who's done this work in places where people die if you get it wrong. Like someone who knows something he doesn't. He pulls her file from the system later, sitting in his office with the door closed. Nursing degree from a community college in Virginia. Work history scattered, 3 hospitals in 5 years, each position shorter than the last. References that are professionally neutral but nothing remarkable. No advanced degrees. No certifications beyond standard nursing credentials. No reason for her to be correcting resident physicians or moving through his unit with that particular kind of calm. He closes the file and makes a note. There's something off about her. Something that needs attention. Something that needs correcting. At 12:44 a.m., Ashley passes his office. She doesn't know he's looking at her through the glass panel. She doesn't know that his resentment has already begun to crystallize into something more purposeful, not anger, which would be quick and loud, but the slow, methodical annoyance of a man who's decided to fix a problem. She doesn't know that the next words he speaks about her will be designed to plant doubt, to suggest incompetence without accusation, to make her look smaller until she stops moving like she belongs in this hospital. She checks on Colonel Shaw again. He's asleep. His vital signs hold steady. The monitor beeps its quiet rhythm, and Ashley stands for exactly 6 seconds in the doorway, her presence a promise she can't speak out loud. Then she turns and walks back to the nurse's station, her hand brushing the pocket where she keeps a ballpoint pen. Behind that pen, wrapped around it like a talisman, is a single dog tag made from shrapnel harvested from an IED explosion in Sanjin Valley. The name on it isn't hers. She'll never tell anyone it's there. She'll never acknowledge it exists. But every time her fingers find it, her entire body goes still. Pain is information. And right now, the information is that everything she's hidden from everyone in this hospital is about to crash into the world like a combat landing that has nowhere to go but forward. Thursday morning arrived like every other Thursday, except it didn't. The conference room at Seattle General filled with 20 residents and attendings, their voices a low murmur of caffeine and ambition. Ashley stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the projection screen glow to life. Dr. Mercer commanded the space like a surgeon commanded the OR, with the casual authority of a man who'd never been questioned. He pulled up her charting. Colonel Bradley Shaw's post-operative notes, each one meticulous, each one a small act of defiance masked as clinical diligence. Mercer's laser pointer circled her entries like a predator circling prey. Here we have Nurse Cooper's creative interpretation of post-op protocols, Mercer announced, his voice carrying the blade edge of contempt wrapped in professorial polish. The pointer stabbed at the screen. Notice the unauthorized vitals frequency. The presumptuous medication timing suggestions. He turned to the crowd. Perhaps Nurse Cooper attended medical school in her spare time. Laughter rippled through the room. Residents exchanged glances, eyes glinting with a thrill of shared mockery. One resident snickered openly, nudging his neighbor. Ashley's jaw didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. But her eyes tracked Mercer's movements with the same precision she'd used to scan sandstorm horizons for insurgent positions. Mercer met her gaze and smiled. Or perhaps she's been watching too much television. More laughter. Louder now. The sound bounced off the walls like shrapnel. Let's move on, Mercer said, dismissing the group with a flick of his wrist. Residents filed out, still chuckling. A few glanced back at Ashley as if expecting her to crumble, to cry, to show them the breaking point they'd come to witness. She didn't move until the room emptied. Then she approached the projection screen where Shaw's notes still hung, frozen on the display like evidence at a crime scene. Mercer was erasing his notes, shoulders relaxed, the work of demolition already behind him. Those modifications prevented a cascade event, Ashley said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. Didn't rise. Just stated fact like a medical instrument stating temperature. Your protocol would have missed the warning signs. Mercer didn't turn around. Know your lane, nurse. Or find a new hospital. 2 words. That's all it took to shift something in the air between them. 2 words, and Ashley understood that this wasn't about her competence. This was about Mercer's fear of it. The following day, Ashley opened her locker to find memes printed and taped to the inside of the door. Nurse is playing doctor. Dunning-Kruger graphs with her name photoshopped into the confidence axis. Someone had drawn a stethoscope in her hand and a dunce cap on her head. The paper felt cheap and sticky under her fingers. She removed each one without expression, dropping them into the waste bin below. At the vending machine on 3 North, 2 nurses she'd trained with stood ahead of her in line. Jessica and Maria. They'd worked together for 3 years. Ashley had taught Jessica how to place a difficult peripheral line. Had covered Maria's shift when her daughter was hospitalized. When they saw her, they went silent. Not the comfortable silence of friendship. The silence of calculation, of deciding whether association was worth the cost. Mercer's right, Ash, Maria said, not meeting her eyes. You do overstep. Jessica pretended to search for coins in her pocket, shoulders curved away like a plant turning from shadow. Neither of them stayed long enough for Ashley to respond. They drifted toward the hallway, voices resuming only when they thought distance had rendered her deaf. The betrayal landed somewhere deep. Not in her chest where emotions lived, but lower, in the place where survival instinct kept its ledgers. She recorded it. Categorized it. Moved forward. By Friday afternoon, Mercer elevated his tactics. Ashley was adjusting the flow rate on Shaw's line, bringing it down from 100 milliliters per hour to 75, because his blood pressure was tracking too low and his oxygen saturation was climbing, which meant his heart was working too hard to compensate, when Mercer appeared in the doorway. "That's the third time you've modified physician orders without authorization," Mercer announced loudly enough that the entire corridor heard. His voice carried the weight of institutional power, of credentials and committees and the ability to make her disappear from this hospital. "Continue, and security will escort you out. Permanently." The threat hung in the fluorescent lit air like a guillotine blade suspended from silk thread. Ashley finished the adjustment. Checked the line. Turned to face him. She didn't move toward him. Didn't raise her voice. Just let the silence between them become a third presence in the hallway, something with shape and weight. 10 seconds. 12. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm in the room behind her, indifferent to power struggles and institutional hierarchies. Then Ashley leaned in close enough that only Mercer could hear her. Close enough that she could see the capillaries in his eyes, the slight tremor in his jaw, the animal recognition of a predator confronting something it hadn't expected in the prey. "The difference between you and me, Doctor," she said, voice low and sharp as a blade finding the space between ribs, "is that I've had to earn respect in places where incompetence gets people killed." She straightened. Walked away. Didn't look back. Mercer's face purpled, veins bulging like rope under skin. His hands clenched at his sides. But and this was what made the moment truly dangerous, he was smiling. A shark smile. The expression of a man who'd just been given exactly what he needed to destroy her completely. That night, at 2,300 hours, Ashley was in Shaw's room reviewing his morning labs when something flickered across the monitor. A pause in the rhythm. Just one beat. One drop pulse. She pulled the monitor screen closer, watching the waveform trace across the digital display like a seismograph detecting distant tremors. Shaw slept, his breathing steady, his face carved from something harder than most men's flesh. The folded flag from her locker sat in her scrub pocket, tucked beside her badge, the colors beneath the fabric where her hand rested like a prayer against her ribs. She'd been protecting him for 87 days. She'd been protecting him since the moment she'd learned he was the one who'd pulled her son out of the ambush at Phi Base Tillman, since she'd received the letter Shaw had written by lamplight in some forward operating base, his words describing the way her boy had fought, the way he'd earned the respect of men who didn't give respect, they demanded it. If Mercer found out why she was modifying protocols. If he discovered that Shaw wasn't just another cardiac patient. If he understood that every decision she made at his bedside was calculated to keep him alive long enough for his intelligence to be processed and filed and weaponized. The code would come. It always came when you pushed this hard against the machine. And then the phone rang. The cardiac monitor's rhythm flatlined at 2:43 a.m. in room 3 West, and Colonel Bradley Shaw's body went slack against the hospital bed like a marionette with cut strings. Ashley was checking his post-procedure vitals when his eyes rolled back, when his chest stopped rising, when the world tilted into the narrow space between life and the alternative. The monitor screamed. 3 short beeps, then continuous wail. She pressed the code button. It was muscle memory, the same way her lungs had learned to breathe in thin mountain air, the same way her hands had learned to work in darkness. Code blue. Trauma Bay 3 West. The overhead speakers crackled the announcement across the hospital, and within 90 seconds, the room flooded with bodies, residents, nurses, the rapid response team moving with the controlled chaos of a unit that had done this 100 times before. Dr. Mercer arrived third, walking past the crash cart like a man entering a familiar room, his white coat crisp as fresh paper. He took position at the head of the bed without breaking stride. "Resume compressions," he said, and a resident, a thin kid named Patterson with trembling hands, continued the chest compressions Ashley had started before help arrived. The compressions looked adequate on the surface. They weren't. Ashley could see it in the shallow depth, the wasted energy, the lack of intention. But she stayed silent. That was the protocol now. That was her place. The monitor showed asystole. Flat line. Mercer ordered epinephrine, 1 milligram for push, and a pharmacist in the corner called out epi in, marking it on the whiteboard. They resumed compressions. 2 minutes ticked past. The monitor spiked, just for an instant, a flutter of electrical activity, then flatlined again. Pulseless electrical activity. PA rhythm. The kind that meant Shaw's heart had forgotten its job completely, and drugs alone weren't going to remind it. 2 minutes 30 seconds, someone called out. Ashley's eyes never left the monitor. She'd seen this pattern before, in a field hospital outside Kabul, in a medevac helicopter over Helmand province. She'd seen it in the faces of men who didn't make it home. The pattern meant one thing: Shaw wasn't dying from a simple cardiac event. Something mechanical was blocking his circulation. Tamponade. Massive pulmonary embolism. Tension pneumothorax. Something that needed intervention beyond the algorithm printed on the crash cart wall. Another epi round, Mercer ordered. His voice was steady, clinical, the voice of a man following the protocol he'd learned in residency and never deviated from since. The pharmacist prepared the syringe. Ashley watched Mercer's hands as he reviewed the monitor, watched the minute tremor in his fingers as he stared at the flat line, as if the sheer force of his authority might intimidate Shaw's heart back into rhythm. It wouldn't. She knew it wouldn't. She'd held too many hands in too many moments when authority meant nothing against physics and biology. For minutes. Patterson's compressions were degrading. Fatigue was setting in. His depth was shallower now, his rhythm losing precision. Ashley could see Shaw's sternum wasn't returning to full expansion between compressions. Not enough pressure. Not enough time to perfuse the brain. Not enough to bring him back. "Doctor," she heard herself say. Her voice came out steady, flat, careful not to inflect with the urgency screaming in her chest. "He's not responding to standard ACLS. Could be tamponade or massive PE. We need to." Mercer's head snapped toward her. His eyes had changed. They weren't cold anymore, they were the eyes of a man who suddenly realized he was drowning, and the life preserver was being thrown by someone he'd spent the last 6 hours trying to drown. "You do not diagnose," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. "You compress. Or get out." The room felt smaller. Ashley stepped back, hands raised, and Patterson took over full compressions. Someone's hands are on Shaw's chest now, she thought. Not mine. Not the hands that knew what to do. The hands that had learned in desert operating tents, that had felt ribs crack under pressure, that understood the difference between textbook compressions and the kind that actually brought people back. She watched from the corner. She'd been pushed into the corner before. She knew how to wait. 5 minutes. Mercer called for another round of epinephrine. That was dose number 5. Ashley knew the guidelines as well as he did, probably better. Guidelines said stop at 2 doses, reassess, consider reversible causes. Guidelines said if you weren't getting a rhythm by now, you needed to fix what was broken, not just keep flooding the system with drugs. But Mercer was a surgeon, trained to cut and repair, trained to solve problems he could see under a light and fix with steel. He wasn't trained to accept that sometimes the problem was invisible, and sometimes the solution came from instinct instead of the printed protocol. The monitor showed another flutter. Just a brief spike, a single heartbeat's worth of electrical activity, then flatline again. Shaw's pupils were dilated now, fixed, the dark centers of his eyes expanding beyond the iris like someone looking into an infinite distance. 6 minutes. The pharmacist whispered something to a resident. Ashley caught the words, "That's dose 5. Guidelines say." "I know the guidelines," Mercer snapped. His voice carried the edge of something breaking, the sound of a man who understood that his knowledge had reached its limit and found the limit insufficient. His hands were trembling now. She could see them from across the room, see the slight oscillation as he gripped the monitor, as if steadying his body against an invisible current. He was following the algorithm because it was all he knew how to follow. The algorithm had always worked before. The algorithm was supposed to work. But the algorithm was failing. Time in a code feels different. Hours compress into seconds. Vital information becomes irrelevant noise. Everything narrows to one point: the monitor. The rhythm. Whether the heart will start again. Ashley had been trained to notice when the algorithm broke down, trained in places where there was no crash cart, no pharmacist, no residents ready with medications. Trained in field hospitals where the only option was to do what was impossible or watch people die. She calculated. Shaw was the key to the operation. Shaw carried intelligence that would disrupt operations across 3 provinces. Shaw was also the man who'd commanded the unit where her son served, the man who'd sent that unit home intact, the man whose leadership was the only reason the folded flag in her locker belonged to someone she'd never met instead of someone she'd loved. She calculated the odds. 7 minutes. 8. The brain needed blood flow. Continuous, adequate blood flow. After 5 minutes without it, irreversible damage began. After 10 minutes, Shaw would be a breathing corpse wearing his own name. She made the decision the way she'd made 1,000 decisions in the Hindu Kush. She stopped thinking and moved. Scalpel kit. Now, she said. Not a request. Her voice had shifted. The courtesy was gone. The apology was gone. What remained was pure command, the kind that came from a place where people died if you asked politely. A resident's eyes went wide. Nurse, what are you? Ashley was already moving toward the crash cart. Her hands found the surgical scalpel, a 10-blade, smaller than she'd prefer but adequate for the job. The handles felt correct, weighted like an extension of her skeleton. She'd used instruments like this in moonless nights, under the shaking light of a field lantern, with rounds coming closer every minute. This fluorescent room, this clean bed, this organized crisis felt like a simulation. Mercer realized what she was about to do. Stop, he said. His voice had lost all authority. It was the voice of a man watching something inevitable. Stop. You are not authorized. Ashley didn't stop. She cut. 5th intercostal space, laterally positioned to the sternum, through skin and fascia and intercostal muscle. The scalpel moved with the confidence of hands that had performed this procedure 47 times before, in conditions that would have made this clean hospital room feel like a surgical palace. Blood welled in the incision, not as much as she'd expected, Shaw's circulatory system already failing, pressure dropping like a stone, and she grabbed the rib spreader from the kit, her fingers finding their grip without conscious thought. The ribs cracked as she opened the spreader. The sound was distinctive, unmistakable, a dull snap of bone yielding to pressure. The room went absolutely silent. Even the monitor seemed to quiet, the beeping reduced to background static in a space where the only real sound was the crack of Shaw's rib cage opening under her hands. She reached inside. Skin and tissue warm against her palms. Her fingers found Shaw's heart, a muscle the size of a fist, still and useless and surrounded by blood from the surgical procedure that had gone wrong. She began compressions. Manual compressions, her hand wrapped around the ventricle, feeling for the chambers, squeezing with the exact pressure needed to force blood through a system that had given up on its own. She could feel Shaw's heart in her hand. She could feel it responding, could sense the moment her compressions convinced it to remember what it was supposed to do. The monitor climbed. 80. 90. 100. A rhythm emerged, not perfect, not stable, but a rhythm. Actual electrical activity. Actual heartbeats. The monitor's wail changed pitch, the continuous flat line breaking into discrete beeps, each one a pulse, each one a signal that Shaw's heart had remembered its purpose. Ashley stepped back. Blood covered her up to the elbows. Her breathing was hard and even, the kind of breathing that came from controlled intensity. The room remained silent. The silence was the kind you could operate in, the kind that came when everyone understood they'd just watched something that shouldn't exist do exactly what it needed to do. Mercer stared at her. His mouth moved. No sound came out. Then his eyes narrowed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady again, steadier than it had been in minutes. You just ended your career, he said. The words came out like someone reading from a predetermined script, the only response available to him now that every other option had been exhausted. Security. Hospital administration. That's assault on a physician. That's practicing medicine without a license. That's... But he was still staring at Shaw's monitor, where the rhythm climbed higher, where the cardiac output was returning, where a man who should be dead was beginning to live again. The hallway smelled like copper and antiseptic, a combination that belonged nowhere in a hospital. Ashley's scrubs clung to her skin, soaked through with Shaw's blood, not metaphorically, literally. Her hands had stopped shaking exactly 12 seconds ago. That was the adrenaline bottoming out, the crash that came when survival switched to aftermath. She stood motionless outside the OR, watching the cardiothoracic surgeons wheel Shaw through the double doors, his chest already prepped for the emergency repair, his cardiac rhythm climbing steadily on the portable monitor. 84. 86. 92. He was coming back. The man should have been dead in the hallway, but he was coming back. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past her without looking. The water sloshed. The wheels squeaked. Ordinary sounds for an ordinary night. Nothing about this was ordinary. Ashley's hands knew what they'd done, felt the give of the ribs cracking, muscle memory from 17 years of combat medicine screaming through her fingertips. Her hands had held lives together in places where incompetence meant caskets, where field hospitals reeked of diesel and infection and the kind of silence that came after you lost someone. Her hands had done what surgeons in pressed white coats refused to do. Dr. Mercer was already on his phone. She could see him through the OR window, his face mottled with rage, his voice clipped and urgent. He was building his narrative. Filing the story that would end her. Ashley understood documentation, understood that Mercer's version would have 17 bullet points before she even left the hospital. Unauthorized invasive procedure. No attending authorization. Reckless endangerment. Practicing medicine without a license. He was competent like that. Methodical. He would not scream and flail. He would use the system like a weapon, each policy violation a blade, each protocol violation a stroke of precision that built a termination case as tight and airtight as a sealed surgical field. By 2:33 a.m., HR had summoned her. A conference room on the 4th floor. The director of nursing sat beside a hospital attorney, both their faces carved from the kind of professional sympathy that meant the decision was already made. They'd done this before. They would do it again. Mercer stood to the side, his binder already assembled. Color-coded tabs. Incident reports. Witness statements from 3 residents who'd been in the hallway, residents who'd watched her save a man's life while their attending froze like a statue. Those same residents would put their names on whatever narrative Mercer had prepared. That was how it worked. Power flowed downward. Careers depended on remembering who held the knife. The director opened with the standard language. Ms. Cooper, you're aware of the allegations. 17 protocol violations, the attorney added, sliding papers across the table like dealing cards. Section 4.2.1 of our surgical emergency guidelines explicitly prohibits. Mercer spoke quietly. Cardiac tamponade requires immediate surgical intervention, yes. But only a licensed physician can authorize the procedure. A nurse cannot simply decide to crack a patient's chest and reach inside there. The patient was dead. Ashley's voice came out flat. Not defensive. Just a statement of fact. No pulse. No pressure. Dead. Which is why you should have called the attending. Initiated ACLS protocol. Waited for the surgical team. There was no time to wait for a surgical team. There was no time for ACLS. There was time for one intervention. 60 seconds. I used them. The attorney cleared his throat. Regardless of outcome, Captain, he stopped. Regardless of outcome, Ms. Cooper, the procedure violates multiple state nursing board regulations. We have documentation from State Law 16.4.3 regarding scope of practice limitations. The board will be notified. An investigation will follow. Mercer's voice was almost gentle. You saved his life, possibly. But you did it outside the bounds of your license. In this hospital, that means termination. Immediately. The director looked away. We're suspending you pending investigation. You need to surrender your badge and clear out your locker. We'll be in contact about the formal hearing. Ashley stood. Mercer was watching her, waiting for tears or rage or some fracture in her composure. She didn't give him one. She walked out of the conference room with her spine straight, rode the elevator down to the locker room, and methodically emptied her belongings into a duffel bag. 7 years of night shifts. Photographs taped inside the door. A spare pair of shoes. The folded flag. She held it for a moment before securing it in the bag. Marcus Reynolds' flag, pressed and folded by honor guards, given to her 3 years ago when her teammate never came home. She'd kept it in her locker ever since, next to Shaw's room. Every shift a reminder of why she couldn't fail. Every shift a weight. She was already blown. When HR ran her background check for the termination hearing, the system would flag her classified security clearance. There was no hiding from that. The Pentagon would get the alert. Command would pull her out. The mission, protecting Shaw, keeping him breathing, keeping him safe for his handlers, was compromised. Not by her. By Mercer's bureaucratic precision. He'd wanted to destroy her professionally, and in doing so, he destroyed everything else. The diner appeared at 3:17 a.m. like a refuge. 20 minutes of aimless driving through Norfolk's empty streets, past closed shops and dark houses, and she'd found a place called Morton's on the edge of the city, the kind of place that existed for truckers and night shift nurses and people with nowhere else to go. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A waitress in her 60s poured coffee without asking. A single trucker sat in a corner booth, reading a 3-day-old newspaper. Ashley sat by the window and watched her own reflection stare back at her. Hollow eye didn't cover it. She looked like someone who'd been carved out. Hair pulled back so tight her scalp ached. Blood still visible under her fingernails despite the scrubbing in the OR scrub sink. Her uniform had been medical, scrub soaked in someone else's mortality. Now she wore the jeans and simple blouse she'd changed into, and she looked like nobody. Looked like nothing. Looked like a woman who'd saved a colonel's life and lost her own in the bargain. The coffee cooled in front of her. She didn't drink it. The cup became a clock, watching the steam die, watching the temperature plummet, watching the surface tension collapse. Shaw would make it. She knew that with the kind of certainty that came from having seen enough bodies to recognize when one was coming back. His rhythm had climbed. His pupils had responded. His heart had remembered how to beat. The cardiothoracic surgeons would repair the tamponade, close the pericardium, and Shaw would live to carry his classified intelligence back to handlers who'd send him to another field, another mission, another 18-hour operation where someone else's life depended on him staying conscious. But the mission was finished. When the background check flagged her clearance, when the Pentagon's computers lit up with alerts, when Command pulled her for operational debrief, her placement at Seattle General was done. Mercer had handed her a termination letter. The system had handed her a dishonorable discharge from her own legend. And Shaw, the man she'd been assigned to protect, would be left in Mercer's care. Left with a surgeon who froze under pressure, who mocked competence, who built his power on the destruction of people who threatened his narrative. She thought about Marcus Reynolds. Thought about the convoy in the Hindu Kush. Thought about the moment the IED detonated and Marcus had reached for her hand and said, "You're gonna be okay, capital. You're gonna make it out of here and do something that matters." She had. She'd become Special Forces combat medic. She'd completed 17 classified missions. She'd carried his folded flag through 7 years of night shifts and held it like a talisman against the darkness. But she'd also saved one man's life and lost her career in the act. She'd made the only decision there was to make, the medical decision, the moral decision, the one that commanders would approve and systems would condemn, and now she was sitting in a diner at 3 a.m., watching her reflection hollow out in the window glass, wondering if saving Colonel Shaw had cost her the mission that might save her son's entire unit. Wondering if walking away meant her son deployed to the Hindu Kush would lose the only commanders who remembered that competence mattered more than rank. The waitress refilled her coffee without asking. "Rough night?" Her voice was kind in the way that suggested she'd seen 1,000 rough nights. Something like that. Ashley's voice sounded like someone else's. Someone smaller. Someone defeated. Outside, the sky began its long transition from absolute black to the grey-blue of pre-dawn. Rain started somewhere around 3:41 a.m., light at first, then heavier, hammering the diner's windows like artillery in the distance. The trucker finished his newspaper and left a $5 bill on his table. The waitress cleared his dishes with practiced efficiency. And Ashley sat motionless, the folded flag on the booth beside her, her cold coffee untouched, her reflection accusatory, her mind running through scenario after scenario of operational failure. She didn't know yet that the background check would trigger more than alerts. She didn't know that the Pentagon was already moving. She didn't know that a Marine Corps liaison was being briefed on the termination hearing. She didn't know that Colonel Shaw was conscious in recovery, breathing on his own, already making phone calls to secure his protector. She didn't know that the system she'd trusted to keep her mission classified was about to come crashing into her life with full authority, full transparency, and full retribution against the man who'd tried to bury a legend under protocol violations. All she knew at 3:13 a.m. was that the rain wouldn't stop, her coffee wouldn't warm, and somewhere in the Hindu Kush, her son was leading men into territory where commanders like Shaw were the difference between coming home in a body bag or walking off a helicopter with your friends beside you. She'd given everything to protect that man. She'd blown her cover. She'd lost her position. And somewhere in the next 48 hours, the Pentagon would decide if the sacrifice had been worth the operational compromise. The rain hammered harder. The windows fogged. Her reflection disappeared, and in that moment, Ashley Cooper understood what was about to happen. Command didn't lose assets like her. And they absolutely, completely, irrevocably destroyed men who tried to eliminate them. The hospital's routine background check for Ashley's termination hearing triggered something nobody expected. The system flagged her security clearance, not a standard civilian credential but a compartmentalized Pentagon classification that hadn't been deactivated because the Pentagon didn't deactivate things. It just quietly logged access attempts. Within 48 hours, automated alerts climbed the chain of command like electricity through copper wire. Captain Ashley Cooper. Active clearance. Classified assignment. Termination hearing initiated by civilian hospital administrator. The machinery of the Department of Defense doesn't move fast, but it moves with the precision of something designed to move very fast when needed. Tuesday morning, Ashley walked past room 3 West on her way to HR for what she assumed was her final humiliation before unemployment. Colonel Bradley Shaw was sitting up in bed, color returning to his face, monitors beeping their steady rhythm. His eyes tracked her movement. She didn't stop. Training. Never break pattern. Never acknowledge. But Shaw's voice came soft as a whisper, the kind of whisper that carries across a room without seeming to try. Viper 6. Her combat call sign. The name nobody in this hospital knew. The name nobody was supposed to know. Ashley's footsteps paused, barely a hesitation, the kind that nobody watching would have noticed. But Shaw saw it. Confirmation. He'd been briefed. Command had moved. The termination hearing took place in a conference room on the 3rd floor, all blonde wood and glass walls that made everything feel both exposed and sterile. Ashley sat across from HR Director Patricia Vance, 2 hospital attorneys, and Dr. Mercer, who'd worn his best expression of righteous indignation. His fingers drummed the table. 17 documented protocol violations. 17. He'd prepared documentation the way a sniper prepares ammunition, careful, patient, meticulous. Patricia was already opening a folder when the door opened without a knock. A Marine Corps liaison officer in dress blue stepped through, his uniform so sharply pressed it could have drawn blood. He was followed by someone in a navy windbreaker with NCIS stitched across the back. Behind them, a woman in civilian clothes carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Ashley's monthly salary used to. The liaison didn't sit down. "Commander Vance, I'm going to read a citation. You'll want this in the record." Mercer started to speak. The liaison continued anyway, voice like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Captain Ashley Cooper, United States Army Special Forces Command. Citation for Valor under fire, Hindu Kush Mountains, Paktika Province. During Operation Mountain Storm, Captain Cooper maintained casualty treatment protocols under sustained small arms fire, prioritized tactical evacuation of 3 critical personnel, and prevented what would have been 3 combat deaths through field medical intervention beyond standard protocol. Despite exposure to active threat, she maintained her position and delivered care that saved her unit commander and 2 additional personnel." The liaison paused. "Read the next line. She did this while absorbing shrapnel from 2 separate IED detonations. Purple Heart recipient, twice." Mercer's face turned the color of bad salmon. He stood up. "This is irrelevant. This woman falsified her credentials. She claimed to be a nurse. She's military. She lied," the woman in civilian clothes finished. She opened her briefcase. Set a folder on the table. Inside were photographs, classified medical documentation, redacted names, operational timestamps, satellite imagery. Captain Cooper was embedded at this hospital on direct Pentagon authorization, authorized to utilize advanced combat medical training as clinically necessary without civilian protocol restriction. Her training exceeds civilian nursing standards by approximately 8 years. The woman looked at Mercer. "The question isn't whether she saved that patient. It's whether you understand what you've done." The NCIS agent set a second folder on the table. "Dr. Mercer, your surgical records have been reviewed as part of this investigation. Because you flagged Captain Cooper's civilian file, our office initiated a review of your medical records dating back 12 years. We found 17 discrepancies. Surgical outcomes documented as complications of procedure when preliminary notes indicate they were documented as errors at the time. A patient who died postoperatively was listed as expired from underlying condition when the anesthesiologist's report documented a critical medication error. 3 more cases where adverse outcomes were reassigned to nursing staff despite your initial documentation suggesting surgical technique failure." Mercer's hands gripped the table's edge. His jaw opened and closed like something automatic, something broken. "I was protecting the hospital. Those errors, I managed them internally." "You were committing fraud," the woman said quietly. The quietness made it worse than shouting. "And you were very, very thorough about documenting it." The door opened again. Everyone straightened. A 2-star general in Class A uniform stepped through. His chest was a constellation of decorations, ribbons stacked like armor. He looked at Ashley, at her empty chair, at the folder being pushed across the table toward Mercer. Then he looked at Dr. Mercer with the expression of someone observing a small animal that had just made a very final mistake. The general saluted. Just once, sharp and deliberate. Salute to the decorations Captain Cooper had earned in a place where incompetence got people killed. Your employment contract includes a morality clause, the woman continued, not even glancing at Mercer now. Falsifying medical records constitutes fraud and violation of the Healthcare Fraud and Abuse Act. We could pursue criminal charges. The State Medical Board will be receiving our full documentation within the hour. I suggest you speak with a criminal defense attorney before you speak to anyone else. Mercer's lawyer, apparently he'd hired one, started making sounds about appeals and proper procedure. Nobody listened. The Marine Corps liaison was already leaving. The NCIS agent gathered her folders. The general was leaving too, his presence in the room already becoming memory. Within 72 hours, Mercer's office was empty. Security escort, cardboard box, key card deactivated. The medical board suspended his license. The hospital's insurance carrier immediately distanced themselves from any claim he made about the thoracotomy, the protocols, the violations. His carefully documented complaints became Exhibit A in the evidence against him. Every protocol he'd cited, every violation he'd reported, every disciplinary action he'd filed, it all just formed a perfect paper trail leading directly back to him, back to a pattern of deflection and blame shifting so consistent that it couldn't be accidental. The investigation expanded. 17 former colleagues gave statements. A resident who'd questioned his technique and been blacklisted. A surgical nurse who'd documented an error and been fired. 2 families whose deceased relatives' cases suddenly opened for review. Mercer hired an attorney who advised him to settle. The attorneys from the medical board made an offer, permanent license revocation, confidentiality agreement, and Mercer walks away with 40% of his pension intact. If he fought, they'd pursue criminal charges and civil malpractice suits that would bankrupt him in legal fees before the trial started. Mercer signed. 3 months later, driving a 2019 Ford Transit van through the Appalachian foothills, Mercer delivered medical supplies to clinics in towns that didn't know his name. The clinic network didn't ask questions about his background. The pay was $34,000 a year. No benefits. No respect. No patient contact. Just routing slips and loading boxes and the dispatcher's voice crackling through the radio assigning the next pickup, the next delivery. One afternoon, the dispatcher sent him to a small clinic outside Beckley, West Virginia. A former Army medic ran it, a woman with competent hands and eyes that had seen hard things. Mercer carried boxes of gauze and syringes and 4 fluids into her back storage room. The nameplate on his polo shirt read Mercer. She looked at it. Looked at his face. Recognition flickered. "You're that Mercer. From Seattle General." He nodded. She didn't say anything else. Just took the boxes and closed the door. Mercer stood in the supply room, surrounded by inventory for a rural clinic that probably treated more emergency trauma than he'd seen in 5 years, and understood with perfect clarity that his entire identity had been dismantled by the very system he'd weaponized. His meticulous documentation. His careful complaints. His paper trail of destruction. All of it had become evidence against him. The quiet nurse had won. Not through argument. Not through confrontation. Just by being competent when competence was needed. He thought about Ashley sometimes, sitting in that van, hands on the steering wheel. Wondered if she ever thought about him. She didn't. She was somewhere else, somewhere that mattered, somewhere that people depended on her to keep them alive. And then the news came through hospital networks, the kind of news that travels through medical communities like rumors through small towns. Captain Ashley Cooper, decorated Special Forces officer, had been reinstated with back pay and an apology from Seattle General's board. Her security clearance had been upgraded. She'd returned to active duty. 100 Special Forces operators had lined the hospital corridor in dress uniforms, and nobody knew what they were celebrating because the Pentagon doesn't explain itself. But hospital staff who'd worked with her remembered the quiet nurse who'd always known exactly what to do. They remembered the way she moved. The way she thought 3 steps ahead. The way she'd never hesitated when it mattered most. Colonel Shaw, recovered and cleared for duty, wrote a letter to the hospital board. It was 3 paragraphs. The second paragraph just said, "Some competence doesn't announce itself. Some strength lives in the quiet." Captain Cooper understood both. You were lucky to have her. You were stupid to let her go. You were fortunate that Pentagon Command cared enough to remind you what you'd lost. The letter was framed and hung in the break room. Next to it, hospital staff mounted a plaque. In smaller letters below Ashley's name, "In honor of quiet strength. In honor of bonds forged in combat that no one can break." The folded flag from Staff Sergeant Marcus Reynolds rested on a shelf beside the photo. Ashley in combat fatigues, her son in dress blues, both grinning with the knowledge that some victories don't need witnesses. Just bodies that come home. Just families that aren't destroyed by incompetence disguised as authority. In a medical supply van winding through West Virginia mountains, Mercer delivered boxes and understood the final lesson his entire career had taught him: the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who couldn't see past their own arrogance, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to know that true strength doesn't announce itself. And drop a comment: have you ever been proven right in a way that surprised everyone, including the people who doubted you? I want to hear your story.